there is a very famous, very well-known author that has been accused recently of doing some terrible, terrible things by a few women, and this has, gone on the internet. Many Judaic historians have decided to pull his books from their stores, and it's been headlines in a few places. So I think the reason I want to the question I want to ask from this is, here's a situation where somebody was accused, and could very well be true, what happened to him, and we always want to validate the people who come forward and make such accusations, because it makes no sense why someone would want to do that and go through such an awful thing. At the same time, there's a justice system. There's innocent until proven guilty. But in 2021, it's kind of a theme that sort of, I guess, prosecution by media. It doesn't really matter by the time something gets to the courts. You're prosecuted by the media. What's the Jewish outlook when we have a situation like this where there's accusations and then there's headlines, and what's the right thing? I've been in touch with you throughout the week. There was a question about whether or not it was okay for a specific Jewish news website to make such headlines, calling out this author and shedding light on this situation. What do you think about this?
It's a great question. It's a very difficult question. It's a very sad question. And it's really multiple questions. On the one hand, there's the question of the ethics, the Jewish ethic of journalism. What responsibility do you have to research and check facts? What responsibility do you have to the prohibition of gossip, of lashon hara rechilas, that even if something is true, why do you need to be the source of spreading it? When do people or the public need to be warned? So the responsibility, in fact, is to be transparent and to share information. There's the question from the perspective of the Jewish view of journalism, and what a person, if you're a journalist, if you're an editor, you're a publisher, to choose what headlines to make. But let's focus on the other question, which was your first question, which was, as the consumer of news, Jewish news or any news, how do we absorb it? How do we integrate it? Do we leap to assume that it's accurate and true? Do we spread and share it and forward it? Should we be a little bit more hesitant, a little bit more judicious, a little bit more circumspect? How should we approach when we see such a headline? And I think the answer is really an increasingly lost art in today's world, which is the notion of nuance. The notion of nuance is that we don't have to be so polarized. And life is not such a dichotomy, right? It's not binary. You don't jump on the headline and say, he's evil, he's the worst person ever. We need to not only remove his books, we need to burn his books, and we need to cancel him, and we need to delete him from the universe. Or the opposite, or the people who almost react with an equal level of passion, but in the opposite direction, just out of frustration, to a cancel culture, who say, he's innocent, there's no evidence, he deserves due process, and so on. I think there's a notion of nuance, and I think there's a concept of that middle road that says the following. It says that if somebody's been accused of the kind of horrific things he's been accused of, and I'm very sad, I've had his books in my home, my children have read them, and many of us have had his books, many of us have been inspired, our children have been raised on a generation of his books. And it's very painful, the idea that we're going to cancel him. And I think that this is a perfect example of our bringing some sense of nuance. And the nuance goes like, the type of accusations that are being leveled are dinei nefashos. These are potentially spiritually, even physically life-threatening questions. A person who is capable, or a person who has crossed those boundaries, a person who has behaved in that way, can or has destroyed lives. If a person's a victim of abuse, often their life is destroyed. How much suicidal ideation, how much deep depression, how much mental health, how much a person's inability to get married or function with intimacy because they've been a victim of abuse. These are dinei nefashos. This is nothing short of, we're talking about the highest, most complicated, the most difficult questions of life and death. And because of that, we have to be strict. Because of that, we have to react and say, we have to be cautious. We have to protect the most vulnerable population there are, which is children. We as adults, responsibility to protect them. On the other hand, there is a notion of due process. As you mentioned, the concept of innocent till guilty and due process. And imagine a world to live in which people can anonymously, or even when they lend their name, imagine for you or I, both of us are public personalities to some degree, and imagine somebody who doesn't like Nachi Gordon's red hair, or doesn't like Ephraim Goldberg's gray beard, or something much more significant, doesn't like something we said, or someone we've hosted, or something experience they've had. And so they decide they're going to start a blog anonymously. They're going to spread an email. They're going to create a WhatsApp, and they're going to reach out to a Jewish news organization that doesn't have moral ethics. I'm not saying this one didn't, but they're going to reach out to one that doesn't. And the next thing you know, because there's nothing that goes viral like a controversy, like something salacious. The more salacious it is, the faster it spreads. Your and my lives would be over. It
Right.
doesn't matter if we're
And it's
innocent.
happened to people. I mean, there have been situations where people have been accused and it was a hit job. And that's why this is a discussion, you know?
And it's very hard to undo once it's done. When the accusation has been made, when the anchor has been dropped, when the internet footprint has been created that associates a person's name with those things, it's almost like the Chavetz Chaim's masha with the feathers and the pillow. It's almost impossible to put back in, which is why it's very, very complicated. It's din nefashos, I would argue, in both directions. I can tell you, as the rabbi of a large shul, and there's no rabbi of any size shul that hasn't dealt with in 2021 in the Me Too movement, and in a world that is more transparent, that, as Justice Brandeis said, sunlight is the greatest disinfectant, that today people are more comfortable coming forward, who hasn't had to deal with someone saying that there's a member of your shul who did A, B, or C, or X, Y, Z to me. And now what do? Let's say it's past the statute of limitations, so the police aren't willing to do anything. So on the one hand, the easy way out is to say, well, look, go to the police. And the police are going to say there's nothing we can do because this happened a long time ago. Or the police are going to look into it, but there's nothing that jumps out, and therefore they're going to say there's nothing they can do. So is the Jewish community's response to say, well, we referred it to the police, and the police couldn't do anything, so our hands are now clean? Or do we have a responsibility to go even further? Does the person need to undergo an evaluation or testing for us to confirm they're not a danger to the children or other members of the community? How do we deal with that? With whom do we deal with that? These are difficult, difficult questions. But realize when I've had to, on this side of the desk, which is not a comfortable place to be, deal with those questions, I always think about it's dinei nefashos in both directions. It's life and death in both directions. If the person is guilty and you allow them to operate in the community, potentially risking future people, that's life and death for those innocent victims. On the other hand, if the person's innocent and you jump on the bandwagon of exposing them or of saying they're guilty or of canceling them, you can destroy and murder the individual and their family.
I mean, let's be real. He's already done.
Correct. It seems that way.
True or not, you can't undo what's been said already for him, his kids, his grandkids. You can't undo that. So,
So it's life and death in both
it
directions,
is.
which is why both for a newspaper that's about to report it, or for a court that's about to evaluate it, or for the mental health professional who does that evaluation, or for the rabbi or community leader or lay leaders working to figure out what to do, they need to constantly be mindful that this is life and death in both directions, not only in one. Which is why my answer for me personally is to practice nuance, is to say the following. The image of putting the books in a box is really the image of how we should approach him, which is to say, on the one hand, it's not safe to simply say you're innocent till guilty. On the one hand, to say, we're going to put the books in the box. We're not ready to burn them and throw them out, but we're also not comfortable leaving them on the shelf, given the pattern that's been reported, and given how many people have reported, and given supposedly some significant people who've looked into it. So when you add that all up, we're not comfortable leaving the books on the shelf, but we're also not comfortable without due process simply throwing out the books or burning them in the public square. So the image of putting the books in the box and saying, we're going to wait. We're going to wait until the proper authority, the proper venue has an opportunity to investigate, to give him the chance to clear his name. There actually are experts and professionals who can do evaluations today and give us a sense of what the right thing is to do. And I think as the consumer of this information, as it comes out, what those stores are doing is what we could be doing in our homes as well. And even the way we talk to our children who've read those books and who might have seen those headlines is to say, you know what? They might have done some very bad things. So for right now, we're not so comfortable reading the books, but we believe that, just because someone said something doesn't mean it's true. So we're going to wait to learn and see before we rush to judgment and make a final decision.
I was going to ask you about that as a follow-up. There are many households who have his books on their shelves, and parents could go ahead and be taking those books off, and it could have been their child's favorite book. And Daddy, Abba, Tati, why are we getting rid of this book? I love this book.
Right.
what is a parent to answer? I imagine it's an extremely crucial and important chinuch opportunity, but there's also, with every opportunity, you get it totally wrong. What's
You
the right thing to say?